and I'm going to transition to the next part of things. And hopefully maybe for the discussion piece, we'll hear from some of our other folks. So nice, kind of small, intimate group, looking forward to the conversation. So I'm gonna pass it to Carol. You've already met Carol, but she's gonna hopefully get you a little excited about what is Prairie, why, and a little bit about kind of its historical origins in the area. So Carol, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you. I'll share my screen here. And can you see my screen? Everybody see it?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. Well, surprise, I'm going to talk about prairie and prairie strips. I like to think of this in terms of an ancient landscape and then a modern practice drawing upon that ancient landscape. Can everybody hear me okay? Or if
Yes.
you can't, just let me know. Just shout it out. And just a little bit about my organization. We're a 56-year-old prairie conservation organization and nationally accredited land trust. We protect original unplowed prairie remnants, and we do that by acquiring and managing land. We also create prairie plantings, and we run the 22-year-old Grow Native plant marketing and education program. And in addition, we administer a group called the Missouri Invasive Plant Council. Throughout my career, I meet people all the time who have never seen prairie and can be a little perplexed by it. For example, I have a friend from New York City, and she was living in Missouri for a while, and I explained how rare prairie was. And she said, "What are you talking about? Missouri's covered with grass." Well, she's often seeing the photo that you see. She's seeing a landscape that looks like the photo on the left, which is tall fescue grass. This is not prairie. It's a non-native grass that was introduced in Missouri and other parts of the Midwest and other areas, principally for cattle forage. And there are about 14 million acres of tall fescue in Missouri today. It's covering almost a third of our state. Then sometimes I'll say, well, you know, prairie it's really beautiful and it's full of wildflowers. The photo on the right is an original unplowed prairie in the wintertime. And if you were to drive by this prairie, it looks like just a bunch of grass. But this prairie happens to be actually one of the most biologically diverse prairies in the world. It actually broke a world record for plant species richness on a fine scale. I'm showing you both of these pictures to illustrate that understanding prairie can be a bit hard, a bit difficult when you're new to it. But what ecologists will tell you is that prairie is a complex native grassland ecosystem. It's dominated by perennial warm season grasses, wildflowers, legumes, sedges, and some shrubs. And warm season means that these plants are maturing generally in the warmest part of the year. There are cool season native plants as well, but most of the plants on prairies are warm season. And there can be up to 10% tree cover on prairies. If you look at all of the prairie remnants in Missouri and add up all the plant species, you would find as many as 800 different kinds of plants. And if you add in prairie remnants in Illinois, that number would be even higher. And of course, there are thousands of arthropods and other invertebrates, other animals that are depending on prairie habitat to survive. Can you guys see this box? This meeting is being recorded by the host. Can you see that?
I can't see that.
Okay, that's
no.
fine. That's fine. I just wanted to make sure. Now, the prairie that you see above ground is just part of the picture. We can't see a real hallmark of prairie, which are the complex root systems. And if you think about prairie, you know, growing over thousands of years and those roots growing and decaying and growing and decaying, you can see why the prairie region has some of the richest soil in the world. And these prairie roots store large amounts of atmospheric carbon, and they help slow and filter stormwater, which are really important when it comes to prairie strips. And there's incredible biological diversity below ground. It's not just dirt and roots. These root systems support very diverse microbial communities. And there was a study done in 2012 that shows that the more the diversity of prairie plants correlates to the abundance and diversity fungal types in the soil, which is very interesting. So in Missouri, we are very fortunate that we know what our pre-settlement prairie was, thanks to 12 years of work by Dr. Walter Schrader, who was a geography professor. He's a professor emeritus today. And by looking at the General Land Survey Office notes, he pieced together by reading the description of these surveyors where prairie was and where it wasn't. And he developed this map that you see in front of you. The orange is prairie, and it's about it was about 15 million acres. If you count in what he did not include, which is savanna and open woodlands, which has an understory of prairie species, we'd have a map showing a greater extent of other native grassland types. And we think of prairie as being in rural areas, but and of course, as people were settling here, you know, everything changed. But there were prairies very much. St. Louis was very much a prairie city, and large parts of Kansas City were prairie. And in fact, it's the prairie there that really developed like the cattle industry in Kansas City, because there were pastures there where, you know, if people were drovers were bringing the cattle up there, they could graze on these pastures. In Illinois, this is a pre-settlement prairie map of Illinois. And I can't read everything because this meeting is being recorded by the host is over. But anyway, I think you get you can read it. So incredible amount of prairie in Illinois. Prairie there's not just one kind of prairie. It's not like the prairie that you see when you watch Little House on the Prairie. There's so many different prairie types. And in Missouri, ecologists have defined 12 distinct kinds of prairie. There are Luss Hill prairies up in extreme western Missouri, like what you see before you in this photo. There are sand prairies near the Missouri Boot Heel and in parts of Illinois. Osage Plains prairies in western and southwestern Missouri. Glaciated plains prairies in northern Missouri and Illinois. And what all of these landscapes have in common aesthetically is that they're wide open spaces. You know, there's no canopy of trees kind of hemming you in. It's wide open, but then if you look down in the prairie, it's just chock full of diversity of plants and animals and insect sound and bird sound. So it's really great juxtaposition of wide open space and then all this detail. And I find that really exciting. I apologize that these maps are rather small, but it'll give us a general idea. And I'm sorry for the Illinois folks, I have just Missouri pulled out here, but the map on the left, upper left, is a map of precipitation in the United States. And the darker the green, the more rainfall. You can see in Missouri, we have less. In Illinois, we have less rainfall than, say, you know, parts of Appalachia, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, but much more than Kansas and further west until you get to where Gabrielle lives, and she has got lots of rain. So in Missouri, we have 30 to 50 inches of annual rainfall. I think this is similar to Illinois, but maybe it's a bit less as you get to northern Illinois. The lower map shows these different ecoregions as defined by the Nature Conservancy. So in Missouri, we have 4 different ecoregions, and in Illinois, there are at least 3 or 4 actually. So there are prairie in each of these ecoregions, and there are different things about these ecoregions: the geology, the soil, the rainfall, the position on landscape that determine the kinds of prairie that you find in those ecoregions. This map, you can tell, it kind of correlates to that precipitation map. So in Iowa, Missouri, Illinois, we're in Tallgrass Prairie region. We have the rainfall to support this kind of vegetation. As you go west across the continent, you have shorter vegetation that correlates generally to the rainfall. Modern prairie in central North America is about 8,000 years old, but it's really millions of years in the making. And depending on where you are in the prairie region, it evolved with fire, drought, and grazing animals to greater or lesser degrees, depending on where you are. And this is a relatively newer map that really helps paint a larger picture of prairie and other grassland regions of North America. This is of Eastern North America, but there are grassland types throughout the continent. There are coastal grasslands in New York State and in Washington State. And here in Eastern North America, you can see there are grassland types throughout this region, including, was it Diane in Kentucky? I apologize if I got your name wrong, but definitely there were prairie types, prairie fens, river scours, savannas, many different types of grasslands in the south, in the eastern North America and elsewhere. We sometimes think that, Euro-Americans arrived on the scene and it's this wild, untouched landscape, but that's absolutely not the case. Native Americans have played a very important role in shaping prairie and expanding it, perpetuating it with their fire practices. This photo shows you a shoe made from rattlesnake master plant, which is the illustration that you see here. It's 8,000 years old. It was found in a Missouri cave. So we know that there were Native Americans, working and living, with prairie at that time period. And we don't know the full extent of fire tending of prairies by the Osage and their ancestors in the last 4,000 years, but we do know from early writings of Euro-Americans that Native American use of fire was very planned and organized. It wasn't haphazard. And at the time of the forced removal of Osage Nation members from Missouri in 1825, more than 1/3 of the state was tallgrass prairie and another third was savanna and open woodland. And the Prairie Foundation acknowledges the very significant role of Native American nations and tribes to the prairie landscape, and that they continue to have a sacred relationship with prairie, including the lands that our organization protects. And we honor them as we protect the lands in our care. The Prairie Foundation and other groups and private landowners who own and manage original unplowed prairie, they use fire. They mimic the fires once set by Native Americans or created by lightning by carrying out carefully planned prescribed burns. We burn about 1/3 to 1/2 of each of our prairie tracts annually. We don't burn it all because there are many arthropods and other animals that depend on those standing dead vegetation. And here's just a photo of one of our prairies in Vernon County, an original unplowed prairie. And there is extreme plant diversity in these prairies. And this is that plot on Pennsylvania prairie that I was telling you about. And one of the first slides, I showed that landscape with the dead, the brown vegetation. And these are the botanists who found this world record breaking plot, 20 by 20 inches, found 46 native plant species. Not all prairies are quite as diverse as this, but they are generally much more plant diverse than, say, oak hickory forest, where you might find an average of 7 plant species in a 20 by 20 inch plot. And in Illinois as well, some of these prairie remnants are exceedingly rich in native plant species. So what happened to it? We've converted prairie for row crops. From especially 1837 to present day. We've suppressed fire, which has encouraged invasion of native woody species. And also, of course, we have a lot of non-native species that impacts our prairies and all the places where we live and work and travel and go to school. We've altered not just prairie, but other habitat types as well. So of the 15 million acres of prairie in Missouri that we had up until 1821, we now have fewer than 50,000 acres documented in the Missouri Natural Heritage Database. So this is a dramatic loss. In Illinois, there's even less. According to the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, there's only 2,550 acres left, I believe. But this is a tremendous loss. But in the photo on the right, each one of those little specks that you see is still vital habitat for so many plants and animals that can simply live nowhere else on Earth. Saving original prairie, it's important because it's part of our shared natural inheritance. because these are still vital habitats. And also they are seed sources for the native plant industry. Without these original prairies and their seeds, we can't create prairie strips or prairie plantings along roadsides, which are so prevalent in Iowa. Just a quick word about how important prairies are for pollinating insects. In Missouri, anyway, prairies and other native grassland types provide, or there are more species of pollinating insects on prairie and other native grassland types than any other habitat. And 85% of flowering plants require an animal, mostly insects, and most importantly, bees to move pollen, to set seed and fruit. These are the chief pollinators in our part of the world, and bees are the most efficient of them. Prairies are also important habitat for declining grassland birds, not just prairies, but also prairie plantings. So we must continue to protect remaining prairie for many reasons. And these temperate grasslands are the least conserved, most threatened major terrestrial community on Earth. Our organization, as I said, we acquire land whenever we have the funds to do so, and we are member supported, rely on individual donations, grants, other funds, and we currently own and manage 30 properties, most of them original unplowed prairie. And we also do prairie plantings as well. And these are all open to the public to enjoy, and you can find details on our website about each one. So these prairies are really important in their own right, but they're also important because these landscapes are rich with native plants that are sources of seed for the native plant industry. And these arrows that you see here are pointing to just a few of the many prairie plants from which seeds are sustainably harvested from our prairies and some other prairies in Missouri for the native seed industry. My dad worked with prairie, and he always says, "Oh, come see this prairie I made." I'm always like, "Dad, you can't make a prairie." So I just like to emphasize that we can't really put prairie on our land or our farms if it wasn't there to begin with. We can't recreate an entire ecosystem, but we can put prairie plantings on our land, and that's very important. And I know in common discussion, we might use that word, planting prairie, and I understand that, but I guess I just do want to make it so it's so important to understand that a prairie is more than just the plants. It's the microorganisms and insects, and there's some plants that simply sort of defy cultivation. You can find them only on our original prairie, just to show how important these original unplowed prairie remnants are. And then, so one of the applications of these prairie plants are creating these prairie strips. And others have more experience with prairie strips than I do, so I'm gonna skim over this. But prairie strips does stand for strategic integration of row crops with prairie strips, and chiefly developed to help improve water quality and protect soil, but also to provide pollinator and to some extent bird habitat as well. If you think about all of the water that drains from such a large part of our country, draining into the Mississippi River Basin and emptying into the Gulf of Mexico, and you think about how much land is in agriculture, and there are cities as well, as you can see here, cities and farms, draining from those areas, the water carrying with it sediment, fertilizer, other pollutants, ending up into the Gulf of Mexico. And those fertilizers encourage algal growth. And as those algae decay, they're depleting oxygen in the Gulf and impacting fisheries there. But prairie strips can help reverse this trend. Now, you may have seen this infographic that I think does a great job of summing up the results of the studies of the strip research team. It really speaks for itself, but you can see by just putting 10% of a crop field in prairie strips, you have a 95% less soil leaving that area and dramatic reduction in the loss of phosphorus and nitrogen. Through 2023, the Prairie Foundation has grant funds to help farmers fund the establishment of prairie strips on their corn and soybean fields. So if you're interested in doing this, do contact your NRCS representative in your area to see if you qualify, and then contact me because I can help pay for the seeds for that establishment. And I think that's all I have. And I don't know if there's time for questions or if anybody has any, but I'd be happy to try to address them.
Good. If folks want to put questions in the chat box while we're kind of going through this technical overview, and then we'll try to circle back to them as we get through a few more presentations. So yeah, go ahead and put something in the chat box and we'll circle back. So if something comes to you from Carol's presentation, put it on there and then we'll come back to that. And thank you, Carol. I'm going to transition now and share a video before I invite Dale to share a little bit. We wanted to invite a landowner to share a little bit about their experience of experimenting with prairie strips on their land and to kind of integrate prairie in some different ways. And Dale's done a bit of that. So let me just quickly share this video that the Missouri Prairie Foundation put together, since I give you a little bit more of a flavor of what we're talking about. So let me know if you can't hear me.
I'm Lisa Schultz Moore, and I'm a landscape ecologist. I'm working to make sure that agriculture works better not only for people, but also for the planet. The Corn Belt is amazingly productive as an agricultural system, but it has all these unintended negative consequences in terms of the environment. We leave the soil bare for the majority of the year, which means that our soils are prone to erosion. Because there's no living roots in that ground, we tend to lose the nutrients into our nearby waterways, causing water quality degradation. That fertilizer eventually ends up in our surface water bodies that coalesce into the Mississippi River, and eventually it causes too much growth of algae in the Gulf of Mexico, creating conditions where there's not enough oxygen to sustain the sea life in the Gulf of Mexico. A prairie strip is an agricultural conservation technique in which native grasses and forbs that are planted on a farm field to help build soil, slow down rainfall as it's moving across a field and help it infiltrate, keep the fertilizer out of our waterways, and helps provide habitat for our native wildlife.
I've had this farm for over 30 years, and it's where I've gained most of my experience, you know. So the early things we experimented with are the strips. We started out with terraces, but as it concentrates, the water and the soil erosion that you get still gets concentrated in a particular point, whereas if you had a strip, all of that water would be absorbed by the root systems, and more importantly, the soil actually stays in place. So I think that the strips program that Lisa Schultz Moore is promoting out of Iowa is now part of the NRCS qualified programs. And so we're hoping to educate people with my Northern Missouri farm and this farm as models of what can be hopefully spread across millions of acres.
Largely what I do is I go around and I just talk to farmers and landowners and I try to get them excited about prairie. We're still kind of at the beginning phases of the CP43. We're trying to get some adoption ramped up. If you have a farmer or landowner that you know that's interested in prairie strips, because we're looking for farmers and landowners that are going to be willing to host field tours and kind of do stuff like this. It goes beyond just the economic side. Prairie it's our natural heritage here. It's something that we don't know a lot about because we kind of severed the link to that, you know, by getting rid of so much of it. But it is our natural heritage. It's something we should be proud about. And it's neat for me to kind of help light that fire in other people by just putting a small amount of prairie on their property, and then, you know, it kind of ripples out from there.
We have this opportunity now through research that's been done in Iowa that's shown that planting just 10% of a row crop of a soybean or cornfield, just taking 10% of that and planting it with a strip of prairie plants, of grasses and wildflowers, they've seen 95% reduction in the loss of soil leaving, you know, that row crop field. So this is a way to keep productive farmland productive.
most of the farmers today have technology on their combines. They know where they're breaking even. I mean, the input costs have to be less than your output and what you're finally going to make. And when you depreciate all your equipment and you look at the cost of the fuel that's involved and the time and the risk, there has to be a point where you say, why am I putting this land into corn and beans? You know, if it's not even breaking even, and that's what we did at my North Farm. We rode around in the combines, and wherever we were not even breaking even, we turned that into prairie.
All right, well, that's a nice transition. Beautiful video, lots of great, talk a little bit maybe at some point, but maybe not everyone's prairie looks that beautiful right away. But it's something to aspire to, and we'll chat a little bit about some of those opportunities. So I want to pass it to Dale. Dale already introduced himself as a friend, of course, to the Missouri Prairie Foundation, and growing up on a farm and, being a leader in conservation. But Dale, I'd love for you, I'll pull up your pictures, but I'd love for you maybe just to start off and share a little bit about how you've been kind of integrating prairie and more diverse native plantings on your land, and kind of what got you started and what keeps you going.
Okay, well, the first experience I had was actually with something called quail strips, which we put about 35 acres of quail strips on a farm, on about a 350 acre farm. And quail strips are basically, well, they're the prairie strips without the forbs and the flowers. They're just the native grasses. And I've had those in for probably 16, 17 years now. This is on my second, I had them put in through the Conservation Reserve Program, and I'm on my second contract with that. So I've got them pretty much established and going. I will say that I think they have served their purpose, because when I was growing up, we had quail everywhere, and people would come to hunt and everything on the farm, quail, and it's pretty much disappeared. But since I put these quail strips in, I hear them all the time, all over the place down in the farm now. After I put in the quail strips, I did some other more prairie-like plantings where I had more diverse plantings. Some of them were pollinator plantings. They weren't necessarily in strips. They were just, fields that I was converting to prairie, once again through the Conservation Reserve Program. And then just lately now, I'm looking at maybe, I'm trying to get one of the CP43 quail strip contracts on a small part of the same 350 acre farm I was telling you about. I have kind of got these, and the hardest part for me on these prairie plantings is the establishment, but I have kind of got it down to a formula. And one thing about the prairie strips is they're usually being put in on cultivated land, which is the easiest place to get a prairie planting started, because you've already got rid of all your weeds, you've got rid of all your, your fescue grass or whatever. It's just, usually it's just bare, and that's actually the best place to start from. And I just wait till the winter, and I broadcast the seed that they tell you, in the Conservation Reserve Program, they tell you what seed mix to get. And I just broadcast that, and then I go over that with a Cultipacker, which kind of just barely packs it into the surface a little bit. Helps. I think I did definitely get a better stand by Cultipacking it in than just letting it spread. And then that first year, it's pretty weedy and it's pretty rough looking. There'll be a lot of horseweeds and different just weedy things that come in after disturbance. And so the first year I usually mow it a couple of times, mow it high, and to keep the weeds down and give a little bit of light into the new plants that I'm just trying to get started. And I've had pretty good luck with that. I won't say it's 100%, but usually I've had pretty good luck getting a stand going. I will say, and the other thing too is there is a maintenance involved too. You pretty much every year you have to either burn it or mow it. And that's to keep the sprouts and the woodies from coming in. A lot of my prairie strips are along a woody corridor, and so that's probably worse than usual. Yeah, the pictures. This picture here is one I just took about the middle of April. I had just burned. This is pretty much a prairie strip here. It's technically a quail strip, but I added a whole bunch of the forbs and flowers on my own, and it is actually a pretty good. If you would see it here in a month or two, it's a pretty nice looking planting. It's got a lot of little blue stems, some Cytosgramma, and then just a lot of flowers. It'll be, a lot of yellow in there a little bit later on this summer. But the nice thing about, I burned it. You see over on the left, there's a little green place. That's the tilled field. And then there's two sides with a road around it, which means this is a really easy field to burn. I can do this by myself. It can't get away. It won't get out on the tilled field. It won't cross the road. And that's one thing about these prairie strips. They tend to be, bordered by a field or by a stream or by something that is a barrier. And they are pretty easy to burn. I say they're easier to burn than they are to mow. So that's one nice thing about them. Okay, I'm gonna go to the next slide. This is that same field about, I don't know, 2 weeks later. So it's had a couple of rains on it and all that black is washed off and it's already starting to green up a little bit. If you see that line of trees in the background, and you'll see, it'll be in a little bit better picture of this later on, but you'll see some of the dormant grasses that are along that tree. That's another quail strip that goes up along that tree line. Let's go to the next picture.
Better, it got a little.
Yes.
Yeah,
you can
it
see
in
that
the background. Yeah, it might be.
Yeah, that's the strip right there, that sort of light tan thing. And it's between the cultivated field. And then those trees are along a little draw. There's actually a pond back in there that you can't see. And that strip of trees is actually very narrow. I have another quail strip on the other side of those trees. And I've started now, when I start burning them, it actually burns through that little narrow strip of trees, and it's cleaned up the bottom, along the floor of that little tree corridor there. So that particular quail strip, that's one of the ones that's been in for 16 or 17 years. Okay, next picture. This is the creek that is bordering the quail strip, what I'm protecting. And just to the left is actually where I'm going to be putting in one of the CP43 prairie strips. Next picture. And this is where I'm going to be putting in the CP43 prairie strip this winter, all along this kind of a curvy tree corridor here along that little creek I just showed you. And it's going to be about probably 100 feet wide out into the field there. This is about the only place on the farm that I could find to put a prairie strip because I got the quail strips everywhere else. So that's where I'll be putting that in this winter. I will say my experience on signing it up for the CP43 was a little bit interesting because went into the FSA office and said, this is what I want to do. And the lady who was working with me, I don't think she had ever done a CP43 before. She had to look it up. And didn't really know anything about them, and of course she had to contact the folks over across the hall there in the NRCS about whether or not the land would be eligible and that sort of thing, and that seems to be a hurdle we have cleared. So it is a continuous CRP practice, so you can sign up for it any time of year. One interesting thing to me is the payments, the annual payments that you get, or usually it's a 10-year contract and you get an annual payment. I have farms in 2 counties that are right next to each other, and the CRP payment in the county to the north is twice what the CRP payment is to the county in the south. So the county in the north is about the same amount that I would get, if I was to rent that ground out for cropland, whereas the one in the county to the south is about half of what I would get if I was to rent it out. So it depends a lot on what county to county, what your rental rates will be on those. I think that's pretty much my experience. I don't know if there's any questions that anybody might have on putting in these strips or how to go about it.
We probably have a minute, like a minute or two for a question for Dale. Looks like, oh yeah, Laura and Andy are responding to one of the other questions about integrating natives into terraces. But I think, Dale, you've actually set, I know a little bit of what Laura and Andy are going to talk about. I think you've set them up quite well, and also set up Jason from NRCS to talk about it. I will just emphasize what you said about, I think it is a new practice for NRCS. And I would say that we're experiencing, as a result of doing some of this outreach, that there's still a lot of, growing and learning that's happening on the USDA side. And so for those of you who you might go somewhere and you go, oh man, my local folks don't know too much about it. This part of our goal here is to connect you to some resources and folks to follow up, since I think there is a little bit of growing and learning that's being done in partnership with our USDA partners, because this is newer. So I think there's some, maybe growing pains associated with that, but yeah.
I think I was probably the first one that she's ever had. I maybe even one of the first ones in the state. I'm not sure, because a lot of folks didn't seem to know about it. But I will say I have a cousin who lives in Creston, Iowa. He has got a farm, and he's had prairie strips on his farm for several years now. And I think I think he may have been in kind of on the ground floor of the thing. He's got them established. He's very proud of them, likes to show them off, and has been talking to me about them for years. So I think maybe other states may not be maybe a little farther along than what Missouri is.
Iowa was sort of the start, one of the starts for this effort. So they are, and that's part of actually the grant that's sort of funding some of this work, is to help get this beyond Iowa to grow these practices. Well, thank you, Dale. I really appreciate your time. Maybe just for Dale's going to stay on, I think, for a bit, hopefully to stay in conversation with us, but maybe we'll jump to Laura and Andy to share a little bit more on kind of how to get started. But folks, feel free to keep putting questions in the chat. If we can answer them, in the context of the chat, great. Otherwise, we can bring it into the conversation here in a little bit. So thank you all. Laura, Andy, welcome back.
All right. Yeah, I'll go ahead and share my screen, our screen, and get started here. And that on slideshow. It was great to hear from Carol. I always enjoy hearing Carol talk about Prairie, and also enjoyed the last presentation. So I have a little query for you. If you have been involved in a prairie planting, tell me in chat, what was your most challenging part of that process? And maybe you didn't have any challenges, or what was the most rewarding? So just curious of what the range of experience is about prairie. So what was the most challenging aspect of it? Was it the seeding? Was it finding equipment? Was it weeds, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So making prairie practical, and that's really kind of what we're all about here at the Tallgrass Prairie Center. We're at the University of Northern Iowa on the edge of campus, and in the sort of northeast quadrant of the state. And here's that North American Prairie map that Daryl Smith, founder of Tallgrass Prairie Center, did a few years ago as part of the North American Prairie Conference. And so you can see Illinois is called the Prairie State. And as Iowans, we're a little jealous of that, but you got there first, so okay. And of course, Missouri has quite a bit of beautiful prairie and savanna, or had. If it's a contest, I think Iowa might win. Maybe Illinois would win the sad crown of the least amount of remaining remnant prairie. We're at less than 0.1% of prairie remaining in the state. Almost everything else is corn and soybeans. And so that poses a lot of challenges for finding the seeds to reconstruct prairies or even prairie plantings. This is kind of what the landscape looks like around us. And one of the big questions when you start to try to reconstruct prairies at any scale, whether is where you're going to find the seed for that. And 60% of all of our public land that you could is in a roadside. And back in 1988, the legislature declared that roadside should be managed in a smart way, instead of blanket spraying and mowing all the time. And this legislation set something up to promote the use of diverse native vegetation and more judicious mowing, more strategic mowing and spot spraying. And so we work with county roadside managers across the state. Approximately 40 out of the 90 counties now have some kind of a roadside program. And so that legislation in 1988 forced us to think about how to scale up beyond the very small kind of artisanal private prairie plantings where you collect all your seed by hand and very carefully tend these small areas. All very important work, but when we started working with the counties, we needed 1,000 acres of seed at a time. And so our other programs sort of built around this issue. The roadside program works with these roadside managers, help them find the right seed. We actually have a federal grant that we apply for that provides free native prairie seed for the participating counties, about 1,000 to 1,300 acres a year. Helping them find the right equipment. We do research related to their really applied questions about getting more diverse native perennial vegetation in the roadsides. The question that arose immediately was, well, where is that seed going to come from that they plant? And fortunately for the state and really the region, the Iowa Department of Transportation made a policy decision to preferentially buy seed that was certified from remnant Iowa prairies, not originally from remnant prairies in Iowa. So that source identified seed, we, Tallgrass Prairie Center started developing. So grasses and then legumes and later more and more flowers. And the idea is that a small amount of seed is collected from a variety of remnant populations and then grown out in our greenhouse and our fields. And that's what we're doing right now. We're transplanting about 14,000 seedlings into our transplant seed production plots. And then that seed sits in a cooler. We harvest that, it sits in a cooler. And then when a seed company calls us, we sit there by the phone and we wait for the seed company to call. And then we release a relatively small amount of seed for them to use to start their seed production plot. So the seed that you buy that says Iowa Ecotype seed started in a remnant prairie about 3 or 4 generations ago. And so by that way, we're trying to save and protect the genetic diversity in our region. And a lot of that seed ends up beyond Iowa's borders as well. We started a program in 2015 to kind of jump on board with the Prairie Strips project at Iowa State. We realized we had something to offer because we had so much experience working with roadside managers and helping them with their questions, all the practical issues that come up when you want to plant prairie. And we hold field days, we have demonstration sites on farms where we do the planting for them and help to monitor the site, answer their questions. And then there in the bottom left corner, you can see Tim Youngquist, who was just in the video. We're using a tile camera. It's also called a sewer camera. And that's because so many farmers, when they learn about prairie strips, they're like, but is it going to plug my tile? And so rather than just stand there and say, we don't know, we decided to buy the tile camera, and then we can snake that camera up into their tile systems and look underneath the corn plants, look underneath their cover crops, look underneath their prairie strips or CRP, and look for root systems. And we're planning a feature-length video coming soon to a theater near you under your tile. It's going to be really exciting. The short answer is we don't see many roots under prairie. And then we have a project in Benton County, a very generous donor, a woman landowner, gave the university 77 acres to plant prairie and to try to make it look as much as we can. And I really appreciate the comments earlier about you really can't remake a prairie. We do not have that power, but we're getting better and better at being able to establish more and more species of plants within it. And so fortunately, this project gives us the resources, both a beautiful piece of land and also the resources to kind of, you know, do the best we can on this planting. So 77 acres that we're almost done planting this year. And then we have a research program to try to base our recommendations on good science. So we have various replicated trials going on, both at the Tallgrass Prairie Center and elsewhere, with all the best, you know, features of kind of agronomic science, replicated controlled treatments with replication and randomization. And we're finding out some really useful things and about that really are robust results. So just very briefly, I thought it might be useful for this group to, let me check here and see what the issues are. Well, all right. How's the easiest way to establish the microbiome? Heck if we know. That is definitely an advanced question. So, but what we do know something about is seeds. And I think that if we keep this in mind, practitioners, landowners, people who are helping you with prairie strips, if you keep in mind just the unique situation you're in planting prairie, it kind of all makes sense, the types of things that we do to improve prairie strips, increase their beauty, increase their diversity, their resilience. It all boils down to seeds for me, at least that's a lot of it. And if you look at these seeds, first of all, compared to a corn kernel, they're just tiny. There's a circle around one of the bigger seeds in this collection. And so, you know, they might be less than 1/20th the size of a kernel of corn or soybeans that we're used to planting, or even a lot of our garden seeds, except for maybe lettuce. The small seeds are vulnerable. They're eaten by insects, worms, small mammals, and birds. These are not just seeds or little plant embryos. They're yummy, delicious nuggets of fats and oils. And in some of our studies, 98% of the seeds disappear in 2 weeks due to herbivory, granivory. They're hard to see and to recognize. The seedlings are small, and so you don't know whether they've come up or not. And when they do come up, they can dry out, they can damp off if it's too moldy, if it's too moist. And they're also wonderful little nibbles for small mammals. They need sunlight. They're going to exhaust their energy reserves and die. And the other thing is that they need to be sown on or very near the surface, because they don't have those energy reserves to punch up through an inch of soil like a corn kernel will. And so the need for specialized equipment of some kind to put that seed on the soil surface or very close to the surface. And Dale's comment was really, really important. A broadcast followed by some kind of light dragging or cultipacking is one really good way to do that. Another thing is they are easily blown or washed away. Eroded soil can deposit on top of them and effectively bury them for good. So that's another aspect to think about. We like to use a nurse crop that's planted at the time or even before that, comes up, like oats, and those oats seedlings or small plants help to slow the wind down next to the soil surface. They help to stop that erosion and those depositional processes that can effectively eliminate those seeds that you spent so much money on. Average establishment of, if you plant 100 seeds, average establishment is you'll get 3 plants. But this ranges from 15% down to 0.1% or less, depending on the plant species. So, and that's in a region with good rainfall. So we're trying to bring those numbers up with some of our research, but that's another story. So if you take all these things together about seeds, and the fact that they're also dormant, they will refuse to germinate, many of them, until they've experienced a cold, moist cycle that tells them winter is over, it's safe to come up. So when you put all these things together, they're small. A lot of them get eaten or buried or washed away. They're often dormant and are going to delay germinating for an entire year. You put all those things together, and what you get is that it's just slow. The seeing these plants for the first time, it takes a while. The annual weeds that are in that soil, they're the other part of the prairie plantings. All those weed seeds in the soil, they're in there too. And it's pretty scary to see all these weeds coming up, towering over your planting. But mowing, as Dale mentioned, can deal with that very well. So some of the things basically all the things that we do to try to improve prairie plantings, and the work that we do with farmers that Andy's going to talk about here in a second, is to cope with the fact that the seeds are small and the process is slow. So with that, I'll turn it over to Andy, who's been working with some farmers on their prairie strips to share some of the things that we've learned from them.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll try and run through this pretty quick. I think I couldn't say it much better than Dale. I might give you a call next time I have a question, actually. But yeah, so I'm just going to share a little bit of advice we've got from landowners we've worked with, as well as run through a short sort of case study of one of our places. And so the first point I want to talk about is from Molly Aronowitz. She's a landowner, but she's also a professional farm manager, really interested in sustainability with People's Company. And her point is the whole key to farming in Iowa is to be able to consistently do the same practice over 2,000 acres. In the couple of days, Mother Nature gives you the field conditions you need. End quote. That's especially pertinent this year. I know a lot of my family in central Iowa, they're not farmers, but the whole community is, on edge about getting the planting in. So, prairie strips can kind of work around existing operations and field seasons. So, and that helps mitigate risk is the end part of that first quote. So, and then her father says you'll have trees, and that's just to not scare anybody, but just noting that management and doing it right the first time is really important. So Iowa State does a survey every year with their strip collaborators, and their best bit of advice is patience is key. On the left, you can see a first year establishment. It looks kind of scary and you might think you failed, but don't worry. Stuff will come up eventually, hopefully. Most of the time, I think even our restoration and research manager is worried about his plantings and he's an expert on it. So trust process sort of thing. And then on the right is a well-established planting. You see warm season grasses, you see some forbs, nice, tall and dense. It's helping stop that soil erosion, that sort of thing. So yeah, and so I'll just shortly talk about where this is located. It's on the Roadman farm. It's been in the family for over 160 years, but they haven't actively farmed since the 1920s. And they all live far away on the extreme coast, both Portlands, funny enough. And they heard about prairie strips through the New York Times, believe it or not. and they rely on a professional farm manager, Hertz Farm Management, to do this because they have, you know, it makes them money, but also they have goals of sustainability, and that's what interests them in strips the most. So they went to the farm manager, asked him if it's possible to do this, and he said, sure, let's try and figure it out. He reached out to ISU Strips and us at the TPC. And somebody at the NRCS is going to speak after me. I don't mention that too much in this stuff, but they're the most important collaborator for most of these plantings, especially CRP. They tell you what's required and give you the steps you need to do to be successful. ISU designed the strips, and then basically we seeded them in that sort of relationship. And just talking about, Laura talked about seed and seed mixes. I want to emphasize, don't skimp on the seed. It's a very important part of the process.
Next slide. Sorry.
With your NRCS office, we're talking a lot of CP43. These prairie strips were CP42 when they're implemented. So prairie strips, you can think of it as a not strictly CP43 in terms of form. You know, there's other practices in the past that were used to function as prairie strips, but they weren't prairie strips conservation practice. I apologize if that confused anybody. And then just going back to how the strips are taken care of, the farm operator has been doing most of that maintenance. It's mostly mowing. They've also burned. The local fire department did that. Depending on where you are, the burn regime may be easier, more difficult to get done. So that's something to note. And I skipped over forward, just talking about seeding. It's particular to prairie, so that's something you want to really listen to your technical service advisor about at the NRCS, or think about hiring somebody out who has experience with that. Then just picture the nice strips there, and are using our drill seeder for native seed. And then my last point is, as far as management goes, I think the best advice I have is to get out into the prairie. You planted it, spent the money to do it, took the time to do it, go enjoy it. A great way to do this is to learn some plant ID, actually. Like I mentioned before, I'm not a botanist by training by any means, but each species I want to identify really deepens my appreciation. On the practical side, doing some plant IDs revealed Canada thistle in the prairie. So management wise, did some spraying, did some mowing, not eliminated, but trying to hold it back from taking over. So, and just to close, I want to emphasize this is completely doable. There's people in your corner and resources out there to help you do this. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you, Laura. And I see a quick question. I see some, it looks like Carol did an awesome job providing some resources on the microbiome. But there was one question about what's the green spray by Iowa Department of Transportation. Can you clarify
Sure.
that?
Yes, yes, that is hydro seeding. So they're using a slurry of colored, tinted paper mulch along with their seed, and it just kind of creates a nice moist environment, sticks that seed to the soil, especially on steep slopes of those roadsides. And that's become a preferred way to do prairie plantings and roadsides. It's an expensive piece of equipment, so it's not going to be widely available for prairie plantings. But if you have a very steep slope, it's the way to go.
And I saw you all already gave some good thinking about killing off that brome and some recommendations about how to manage that and get some more native plants into the land. Anything else you wanted to highlight of your comments here that you mentioned to, I think it was to Carrie?
No, well, Carrie had said, they're going to see if their tenant would do the terrace mowing and so forth. And that, I think, ends up becoming, and another comment from Sarah had to do with, finding farmers interested in taking land out of row crop production. And I think that is where the CRP practice comes in. you are getting paid not just for half of the cost of installation, but you're getting paid an annual rental payment that supposedly is about what you would get if you were renting it for row crop production in that area. So that's kind of the way that's the inroad that you have to make.
And Carol's got a question for
Yeah.
timing of seating. Carol, jump in, and then maybe we'll pivot to Jason after this, just to make sure we leave more time for a bit of the discussion at the end.
Sure. I really like your photo with the seeds in the hand and about the predation of seeds. That was really useful. So I just was talking to somebody today about, she wanted to know when to seed. And I was talking about, seeding in the dormant season, stratification. And of course, if you're doing that, if you're putting seed out when you should, or, during dormant season, there's money, many months before the seed might germinate. It's very vulnerable, isn't it, to predation? But there's really no other way, right? There's no really other way to prevent that. Is that correct?
Well, we did a project on some roadside plantings in Iowa, 2 counties, 3 different sites, where we planted in the fall after the first frost. And some plots we added extra bird seed that had been heat killed, and we actually got 37% more seedlings where we had added the extra seed. So think about being in a bar and you've got some mixed nuts in front of you, and then you've got some things that you have to crack open. If you're going to eat the easier food, right? So that does work, although it hasn't been. That was an experimental situation. It had, to my knowledge, nobody's taken us up on it as an applied practice yet, but I have hope that we'll continue to make progress in there. Justin's study, Justin Meissen is the Research and Restoration Program Manager, and he has a study where we've compared a fall seeding to a spring seeding, and that's in the replicated randomized plots. And the establishment of the forbs was way higher. And also the establishment of the cool season grasses and sedges was way higher in the dormant planting. So all of that would have been exposed to seed predation in the field. And even with that, we saw significantly higher rates of spring forb establishment and spring, cool season grasses like your June grass, things like that, and several species of sedges that we put in that seed mix compared to the same exact seed mix planted in the spring. So if it's a forb heavy mix, at least in our climate and soils, dormant seeding, is successful. Now that was drilled, but even a lot of drilled seed ends up on the soil surface, and even drilled seed mice are going to get at. Anything to add there?
Also, just one note is we mix our seed mixes with a bulk material like rice hulls, and that offers some protection as well. Those little seed are mixing in there, getting in there, I think. Yeah. Good to know. And that cover crop, especially for broadcasting as well.
We can get just as deep into the weeds as you want us to get.
Well, I encourage folks, keep things. I like this conversation that's happening on chat. I appreciate it. I want to keep kind of moving us forward to keep leaving time for a discussion. So Jason, if you want to jump in, and I'll just kind of keep nudging you to kind of keep to your 10 minutes or so. And then, but I want to just prime the pump for the group that's here, that we want you to be thinking about kind of as we've been going through this discussion, what is getting you excited about the potential benefits of prairie on your land or in your operation? And if you're getting really eager and you want to put that into the chat, but we kind of want to be eliciting that. What's getting you excited? Has any of that changed from when you joined us and shared in your introductions? And then, we'll hopefully get to hear a little bit about what are some of your challenges for potentially integrating prairie into your land as well. So be thinking about those things. If they come to you, place them in the chat. But without further ado, I want to introduce Jason, who's been a wildlife biologist now for quite some time, has had a stint with Pheasants Forever has been working with NRCS and is now the state biologist for Missouri, which is exciting. And I know he said not able to get out there quite as much as you'd like to on the fields, Jason, but really appreciate you taking the time to join us. For those of you who want to kind of get that USDA support, Jason's going to provide a little context for kind of how to get started.
All right, thank you. I've been asked to talk about getting started with CRP and CP43 specifically. Right now, I'll leave my camera on, but sometimes I have some lag with my home internet. So if my voice doesn't match up with the slides, please somebody interrupt me and let me know that, and I'll turn my camera off, but I'll leave it on for right now. So just a little bit of overview of what I want to talk about. What is CRP? I'll give a little bit of a history, general versus continuous. We've already heard some of that today, those terms. What eligibility is out there, the CP43 Prairie Strips practice, and then the process, which we've already heard a little bit of that as well. So what is CRP? CRP is the Conservation Reserve Program. If you've worked with the federal government at all, you know we love acronyms. So that's what that acronym means. It's the Conservation Reserve Program. It's a land retirement program. It pays an annual rental payment for anywhere from 10 to 15 years based on the contract length decided by the participant. It also pays for cost share for that cover establishment, and cover can be anywhere from, depending on the practice, it can be trees, shrubs, but most of the time it's going to be grasses, forbs. Some practices use introduced grasses, but we're more concerned about the native type covers. It started with the Food Security Act of 1985, what we all call the Farm Bill. Those acts usually have different names throughout the years, but they all, each year, each new Farm Bill is called the Farm Bill. First sign up was in 1986, had a general sign up, and CRP is administered by the Farm Service Agency. So I'm talking about a program that NRCS helps with. We're the technical provider, but the Farm Service Agency is the actual agency that implements CRP. So let's talk a little bit about that history. Why do we have CRP? You know, if you think back into the 50s and 60s, it really had its roots in the soil bank program. A lot of landowners back at that time still had memories of the Dust Bowl, did not want to go back to that type of having those mistakes again. So there was a lot of concern. And so the soil bank came about to establish covers, and actually almost 29 million acres were established in that program. Then throughout the 70s, farm commodity prices really rose. Producers were responding to that by unfortunately breaking up a lot more ground. They have been losing a lot of our native prairies during that time, but also pastures, things like that. And they were planting on some pretty marginal lands, haylands, things of that nature. And this continued until the early 80s when farm income fell to those lowest levels since the Dust Bowls and the Great Depression of the 30s. And additionally with that, USDA was releasing some soil erosion studies and noting that our cropland was eroding at a rate exceeding 3 billion tons per year, which is just boggles the mind to think about how much soil was being lost. And because of depressed prices, public concern for erosion, that resulted in that Food Security Act of 1985, or the Farm Bill, and that established CRP. So what are CRP's goals? When it first came about, the goal was reducing soil erosion, but of course it also was helping those producers that a lot of them lost their farms back in the 80s and things of that nature. So the ones that still had them, they were helping to stabilize the income by enrolling in CRP. Initially, the enrollment goal was 40 to 45 million acres. And by the end of 1989, almost 34 million acres were enrolled, which is just incredible to think about that many acres enrolled in basically 3 years. First sign up in 86. So yeah, just incredible to think about. And CRP has been reauthorized in all the succeeding farm bills. So it does have to get reauthorized just like all of the other USDA programs, and it's been reauthorized since then. But there have been some key changes throughout the years. In 1990, that farm bill, water quality was added as a secondary emphasis along with erosion. They also emphasized some buffers practices at that point. In 1996, they started continuous CRP, and I'll talk about what the differences are here in a minute. And it also initiated a ranking system and general CRP called the Environmental Benefits Index, a way to score out these offers for general CRP, and the higher scoring ones were the ones that were enrolled. In 2014, we took a little bit of a hit. It reduced the acreage cap to 24 million acres by 2018. So, you know, in the past, we could have enrolled over 40 million. In 2014, that farm bill reduced down to 24 million. And if you think about what was going on during that time, we had really good high farm prices in that 2010 to 2013 time period when the farm bill was being discussed. So people said we didn't need CRP as much, but unfortunately we still really do. 2018 increased that cap to 27 million by 2023, but a lot of other stuff was impacted, reduced rental rates, sign-up incentives were reduced with that. But some of that stuff has come back. The new administration has done some things like inflation incentives and climate smart practices. So a little bit of that money has been recouped there. So what is the difference? When I talked about general and continuous, CRP has like 40 something different practices that have different purposes. Some of them are directly for erosion, others you might be wetland restoration or upland bird habitat. And each practice is referred to by a number, CP1 all the way up, and they skip numbers, but CP88, the one we'll talk about here in a minute, is CP43. CP just means conservation practice. Some of these practices are just available during general signups, and those are what we call whole field practices, where people enroll a whole field and establish it to a cover. Others are the continuous practices, which you can enroll in at any time as long as you meet the eligibility requirements out there. Now, you may not enroll it and be able to plant it immediately because you have to wait until the proper planting time, but you can go into your FSA office at any time and sign up for those various continuous practices. Now, this is just the basic eligibility for CRP. You have to have cropland that's farmed 4 out of 6 years between 2012 and 2017. Those years do shift with farm bills. A lot of times they move those years up, but right now under the current farm bill, that's what you're looking at. There's some exceptions for things like crop and alfalfa. I won't get into those details. It must be physically capable of being cropped. It must be owned or operated by the applicant for at least 1 year. And there are AGI limitations. I won't get into that. It also can be enrolled in other programs, for example, other NRCS programs where you establish the cover and you're still within that program's the lifespan of that cover. So for example, a lot of our herbaceous plantings are 5-year lifespans. If you did an EQIP contract and it was only 3 years ago, then you would have to at least wait 2 more years before you can enroll in CRP. I'm going to skip this just due to time, but you do need to set up records with your FSA office if you haven't. But most of the time, if you have eligible land, cropland, that's probably already done because you've been reporting your crop types of crops, your cropland acres. So a lot of times that's done, but I'm going to skip through that real quick and get to CP43. CP43 is available through the continuous sign up, so you can go in at any time. And this is the purpose right here, right out of the CRP manual. And I'll draw you to this. The primary purpose of prairie strips when it comes to the CRP program is to reduce soil erosion and pollution and to protect water quality. Secondary purpose is to provide wildlife and beneficial insect habitat, establishing those diverse plant communities out there. So you have 2 different purposes, but it always has to meet one of these first primary purposes, either reducing soil erosion or protecting water quality. You can, with prairie strips, you can place them through the field as strips through the field. They can go around the perimeter like a field border. They can be parallel or perpendicular to existing grass waterways to increase that filtering. They can be placed in the gradient or level terrace channels or diversion channels. They can't be placed, they're not supposed to be placed on top of constructed terraces, but in the channel behind them to provide that infiltration and filtering. They also can be put on pivot corners of any size, but again, you have to make sure that you're reducing soil erosion or providing water filtering in those situations to be able to be enrolled. Some important notes about prairie strips, which are a little bit different than other CRP practices. You can do limited machinery travel on these, like turning when you're planting or things like that, but it's still, CRP cannot be used as travel lanes, and it's the same way here. You may only use this, like I said before, for normal field operations, harvest, or you're out there planting. Those areas next to grass waterways need to be, can be crossed during machinery, but you can't store equipment, crops, or anything like that on prairie strips. Minimum size requirements, it's got to be at least 30 feet wide. It can go out to an average of 120 feet wide, according to the purpose and to accommodating your farming operation. And it may not exceed 25% of the cropland area tract. So that's the most you can enroll on a cropland area tract. The quick process is, if you want to enroll in this, you need to call or visit your local NRCS FSA Service Center. Most counties have one. Not all counties, some of those have shut down, but most, with a lot of cropland, they do have one. FSA will determine whether your land meets that basic eligibility and as a participant. Then you work with NRCS or a technical service provider. And those are things like we have partners with, here in Missouri, we have partners with the Missouri Department of Conservation, who have private lands conservationists that work in those offices. Well Forever has farm bill biologists in those offices. So those are TSPs that could be working with you to determine, do you meet the suitability and feasibility, and do you address those erosion and water quality resource concerns, and then continue to work with you on your size and placement of those prairie strips. Once that's done, FSA digitizes that prairie strip offer, they change the maps, and they request that plan from NRCS. NRCS or that TSP writes the conservation plan in conjunction with you. They include items such as what your seeding plan needs to be, any maintenance requirements, what type of required management you need to do. You come in, go over that plan with NRCS, sign it, and then sign the contract with FSA. And then you go out and implement it. It's up to you to buy that seed based on the plans. Of course, if you have questions, you can always reach out to NRCS or that TSP, and they help you out with it. Just some other things about CP 43, you can go up to a 15-year contract if you want to. You also get a 32.5% signing incentive payment. So that's like an extra payment that you get in that first year when you sign up for CP 43. You also get a 50% practice incentive payment. And the easiest way to describe that, it's not really cost share, but basically it is. So basically you get 50% what they call cost share, and then you get a 50% practice incentive payment. So basically it gets paid for all the way. You also get a 20% rental rate incentive. So whatever the determined rental rate is for the soils where this is installed, you actually get another 20% on top of it. And a CP 43 also gets another 5% climate smart incentive payment. So extra 25% based on that. You can enroll just regular CP 43, but here in Missouri specifically, we also have what are called SAFE projects that are specific to a particular type of habitat or species. We have a bobwhite quail monarch SAFE that you can enroll CP 43 through. Really the only difference between it and the normal one is that you're required to put milkweed in there to address monarch habitat needs when it comes to the seed mix. And we also have one down in the southeast part of our state in the sand ecosystem where you can do that as well. And I went through that real quick, and I even still went over, but does anybody have any questions?
Jason, it's a lot to cover, and there can be some overwhelm in how to navigate these resources, but I think you definitely provided a good sort of blueprint for how to get started. And just a reminder, we can include a link in some of the follow-up resources on kind of how to find your local NRCS and FSA offices. There are resource centers in almost every county. You can go to the state pages, state website, and usually find your local NRCS county office for both folks in Illinois and Missouri. I don't see any questions come in via chat. I guess the only thing is just to think about, this is one way to get it incentivized from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. There are other ways to do it as well. Some folks decide not to go into that realm. But what's exciting, as Carol mentioned, if you qualify with NRCS in Missouri, at least, she has additional funds to support your efforts. And I think there's actually some resources for Illinois folks as well, with our Sand County Foundation partners. So anyhow, after we send out resources, reach out to us. If you're interested in this, I think there's a lot of support to help facilitate that in the next couple of years. So we will do our best to connect you to resources. Oh, good. Carol says she might have funds she can use in Illinois as well. So what I'd love to do is just spend a moment to discuss. We have a little bit of time. I know we're kind of running up on time, and it's getting late in the central time zone. But I wanted to just spend a little time hearing back from the audience, our participants. You all shared some of your excitement about Prairie. I'd love it if folks who are still on the line could kind of reflect a little bit about, are there any kind of benefits or potential things that you're looking for from integrating Prairie that maybe you weren't thinking about prior to our discussion here today, or something that you're just even more excited about now that we've had this discussion. So let me just leave it up for anyone to come off mute and share. I'm looking, Diana, you still got your camera on. I appreciate that. Anyone else wants to put their camera back on, but anything else that you're getting kind of excited about? What seems like the potential for your land? Diana, do you think you have some resources to convince your husband?
I don't know. Hopefully, it gave us a whole lot more information. This was very, very informative. Just answered a lot more information. Kind of gave me a little more idea of where it might be useful and how to incorporate that into the farm. So yeah, a good starting point. I think we're already in an Equip program, so I'm wondering if that's going to kind of eliminate that for a couple of years.
That's the Equip program for cover crops.
He said it's the Equip program for cover crops. So I don't know if that would. I think
that would not. You'd be okay there. If you had established some type of permanent cover, like a pollinator planting, which has been very, very popular through Equip here in Missouri, but cover crops, those only have a 1-year lifespan. Once you're done with your contract, you're good to go.
Okay.
Well, we have a 3-year Equip program that's just starting this year. We did 1 year of the county helping us out, the soil and water conservation district. Now our tenant's going to do 3 years, and we're set up for that. And the first year's been really good on our cereal rye, and our folks up in Pike County, the folks at NRCS and FSA have been very helpful in getting the things we've been doing the last few years. They've been really great to help us out.
And you can talk that new contract, you can talk with your NRCS office and they'll work with you. Because even then, if you decide to enroll in CRP, we consider that to be a higher conserving use. So, whatever acres you put into CRP, you just won't get paid on those if they had planned cover crop for those acres, you just won't get paid on those.
Okay.
Like I said, the issue is also, what we want to do plus what our tenant wants to do, because we take him into a lot of consideration because we want to make sure he's very successful in his side of the business too.
You raised
Definitely
a good question there, and that's maybe for some of the other folks. Yeah, that kind of highlights the challenges. So, definitely want to hear some of the, what's exciting to you, but are there other challenges that you think you may face in integrating these prairie strips on your land? What is coming up for folks? We heard a little bit kind of getting that tenant buy-in, even as Sarah mentioned, getting buy-in from, farmers taking land out of production. Anyone else, Paula or Ann, Karen, folks want to jump in and share what are some of the challenges that you might face or you're concerned about? It's getting to be that time of the day.
Gabrielle, can I just make a point? I really like the point that was made about concern with the tenant and their comfort level. I think you know, and in Iowa, something like over 50%, maybe 60% of land is rented, and most of the landowners are women, and they're renting to somebody that maybe they've known all their lives and it's like a son to them, and maybe it's somebody that's in the community and so forth. And I think the conservation concerns that landowners have, both for their sense of their ethics, and also the sense of how valuable will my land be when I sell it, the appreciation on the land, both of those are from that landowner perspective. And so some of the professional farm managers that we have gotten to know through another project we're working on through USDA, really looking at that landowner, farm manager, and tenant relationship. What we hear is, it's okay to be firm and to, really emphasize that conservation goal that you have for the land. And it doesn't mean that the tenant is going to lose their shirt over this. We'll figure it out. We'll get this stuff figured out and try to make it so that it's not too tough to do, and listen to your concerns and find a way through it all. So, all the personal relationships are always difficult, but the experience that we've had with Randy Lew's saying, this is pretty easy to incorporate into my production system. Much easier than annually seeding cover crops. You got to get the right window of timing. You might have to have it flown on. What if it doesn't rain after that? It doesn't come up, I still love cover crops. I hope we can do more of that. But the prairie strips practice is much easier. You do it and it's in, and so that might be a selling point for the tenant. And there's assistance, to help get, they don't have to, they're not on their own in installing this practice.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know, Paula, are you trying to jump in? I saw you went back on camera.
I think my main concerns are just invasives that are already pretty well established and water runoff. But I really think that my water runoff concern, if I just start a little farther back from the waterway and then like slowly incorporate it closer and closer, maybe will work. But the invasives just seem to be pretty horrible right here. And with it being just me in a large area, it's really hard to maintain. So that I think is my biggest concern. I don't want to take the time, money, and effort, and then it just not be enough time, money, and effort for the problem.
Anybody speak to the invasives management? I know that is a challenge. We heard from Dale talking about mowing and how critical that is in the beginning to kind of manage and give your natives chance to come up, burning as that's possible. But anybody else want to speak to kind of some strategies for managing those invasives?
I do spot spraying. If it wasn't, the Sericea lespedeza in our part of the world is just, it will take over. And I have lost fields to Sericea lespedeza. So spot spraying is something that I don't think they don't pay me for it as part of the CRP thing, but I do it anyway just because I just have to.
Yeah, and I mean, really the key is starting out with as few invasives as possible. I mean, spraying out, I know, there's, issues with using herbicide and stuff, but one-time use and then just spot spraying is different than using on a whole field year after year, that sort of thing. So, and then limiting, once you have a good establishment, limiting just disturbance is the big thing. That's where the invasives want to come in, is, getting it tore up and whatnot. So.
Like Laura posted an option to a resource that we can try to share that paper too with the follow-up resources, Laura.
Yeah.
And I see, Janet mentioning the Dunn Ranch, Grand River Grasslands. The Nature Conservancy established a large protected area in Missouri. Good resources potentially there. Carol's been, we'll try to include all these resources in our follow-up to folks. Well, I know we're kind of at the top of the hour. Any final kind of either questions or reflections from our participants? Really appreciate people's active engagement. So in terms of next steps, what I've discovered doing this now in a few different places is just that we're really kind of the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more potential. So there was a great deal of interest. Not everyone who registered joined, but what we plan to do is share out the recording from this event with all of you, as well as the registrants. We will have a participant roster, a resource list that will try to bring in as many of these pieces that were mentioned here today, and how to get back in touch with our folks who share their time with us here. Really appreciate all of that. We'll have an evaluation. I put that in the chat a few times. Appreciate if people can fill that out. Helps us improve our programming and helps us think about what kind of comes next. And this is sort of hot off the presses, but for this group, I'll be doing some follow-up with everyone who's participated in these discussions to join me for another kind of shorter discussion, just to kind of spend a little bit more time talking about the potential for prairie, both on your land and maybe in your community. So look for an email from me in the next couple of weeks, inviting you to participate in that, more of a discussion than a presentation. But we're really trying to understand how can we better support landowners and farmers, women, in doing more prairie. What's it going to take to support people to do some of these practices more? So really appreciate everybody's time and continuing the conversation. And so there's a question. So if there is, it looks like a water hemp challenge. So if anyone wants to stay on, I know Laura and Andy, you might be the best suited to respond to that. If you have a chance to respond to that question, maybe you can stay on for another couple minutes. But I just wanted to really appreciate everybody's time, your interest. Carol, any other kind of final, I know you're signing off, any final words of how to stay engaged, or we'll just do that in the follow-up?
Yeah, just if anybody can use any of my money, please use my money. Have a good night.
Thanks, Carol. Thanks, everyone. And
I just wanted to say thanks for this. This has been really nice. I enjoyed it.
Thank you, Paula. Diana, looks like we got an answer for you and your hubby. All right, well, take care, everyone. Have a lovely evening and enjoy the